So, time then for the press preview. It's our first chance to have a look at tomorrow's front pages. And tonight, we'll have a look at the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the political commentator Benedict Spence. Speaking to them in a moment after we've had a look at some of the front pages for you, beginning with the Sunday Express. Leads with an exclusive that Rishi Sunak is planning to cut taxes in autumn, a move they say could keep him in power. That report also features on the front of the Sunday Telegraph, which understands the Prime Minister wants to cut national insurance or income tax by up to 2p ahead of next year's general election. The Observer leads on the run-up to the official COVID inquiry, with a leading scientist describing the Prime Minister's Eat Out to Help Out scheme as spectacularly stupid. While the Sunday Mail reports on Labour being accused of declaring class war on Middle Britain over plans to slash public services in affluent areas. The Manchester Evening News leads on City's win against United in the FA Cup final, with the team hoping for a treble when they face Inter Milan in the Champions League final next weekend. And the Sunday Times also features that story on its front page with a picture of Jack Grealish holding up the FA Cup. The Sun claims Holly Willoughby will make a statement on her first day back on this morning after the resignation of Philip Schofield, who admitted to an affair with a younger colleague. While the Mirror reports that the BBC have been in contact with Holly Willoughby. And the Star warns we could all be wiped out by psycho chatbots who are planning to exterminate all of humanity. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code you see on screen during the programme and check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you're watching us discussing them. And to do that, Rachel Shabi and Benedict Spence. Great to have you with us this Saturday evening. Rachel, front of the Observer, we all remember that scheme, don't we? The Eat Out to Help Out. We thought perhaps it was a good idea at the time if people partook in it. Others thought maybe it was something of a reckless idea. Well, it's been called stupid and could be the focus of the virus inquiry.
Yeah, I do think a lot of people thought it was pretty stupid at the time. So, as you say, this was, I think, the summer of 2020 when Rishi Sunak, who was then Chancellor, had this stupid idea of encouraging people to eat out by offering 50% discounts on people to do so. And there was a study, one study a few weeks later suggested that it caused between 8 to 17% increase in COVID infections that summer. And this is one of the sage scientists being quoted in this Observer piece as saying it was a stupid idea. This is Professor John Edmonds, who's at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He also says, apart from pointing out that this was a stupid idea, that on this and a lot of other things, SAGE wasn't really consulted. Had they been consulted, they would have said to Rishi Sunak and to the government, no, this is dumb, why are you doing it? But also he points out that on a lot of these things, you know, they gave their advice and they didn't really have much of a role to play. And they quite often found out about policy and decisions the same time as we did, i.e., you know, when they were announced as when they were released to the press. So this is one of the things, of course, that will be looked at in this much heralded COVID inquiry. And I do think it's interesting. It's on the Observer front page, this inquiry, and the stupidity or not of Sunak's scheme, but it's really not making many other newspapers.
Yeah, it's interesting, Benedict, isn't it? Because, you know, I mean, thinking back, it seems a long time ago now, doesn't it? But it's all about the balance of risk. And there was a lot of discussion about that at the time, wasn't there? Between the balance between obviously wanting to be rid of the pandemic, but also wanting to protect people's livelihoods.
I think we need to remember at the time the portents of economic doom that were abounding and that were very clear for everybody to see on the horizon. We also need to remember that Rishi Sunak was not the Prime Minister. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it was his job to come up with ways of ensuring that the economy was not cratering as badly as it was. And ultimately, therefore, it must be said, it comes down to the Prime Minister as to what policies were put in place and which weren't. So we can sit here and we can say that it was a stupid policy. It certainly garnered a lot of sort of skepticism at the time, but he was the Chancellor, and we must also remember that he became the Chancellor because he was considered far more pliable a Chancellor than Sajid Javid was by Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. So that's the important thing to remember on the subject of Sunak. I do think that it's very interesting that this Observer piece, it talks about, of course, as it's going to talk about, it leads into the discussion about how much of this of policy was done with the consultation of SAGE, or indeed any other scientists for that matter. Because very often there were accusations made that the government was having its policy entirely led by scientists. That obviously, as we've gone on, has shown to be not so much the case. You had many sort of competing voices in the room, driven by things like ego, driven by things like polling, lots of different things. And ultimately, it all then comes down to the question of what was going on between key government ministers and the Prime Minister, what is going to be revealed. Boris Johnson has given us what he says were all of his WhatsApps, and it's very clear that they're not all of his WhatsApps. He's given us some WhatsApps. There are concerns that this is going to put pressure on Rishi Sunak and other government ministers, potentially civil servants, to reveal their communications. And you can start to see why people are scrambling around, because it's the very last thing I think that the Tories currently want, given the myriad other crises that they have, is to then be embroiled into a he said, she said, it was his fault, it was her fault, sort of tit for tat over the COVID inquiry. But of course, we need it. It's essential that we understand what was going on at the heart of government and why it was that sort of life-altering decisions like this were made on our behalf. So it's a tricky thing, but I don't think there's going to be any escape from it. Try as Rishi Sunak and the government and Cabinet Office might.
Yeah, I think you may well be right. OK, let's move on to the front of the Sunday Telegraph. It's also on the front of the Express, actually. Tax cuts could be on the way, Rachel.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's something that, we could have predicted without too much trouble. I think the idea that the Conservatives would try and introduce some sort of tax cuts ahead of the general election. The Sunday Express seems to think that this will be, to heal Britain, and, very conservative supporting newspaper. Of course, they would say that. I do think it's interesting when we talk about taxes, cuts and rises, we don't really talk about for whom and from where. In this case, the 2% cut, some of that will be a cut to national insurance, which personally, I think that's a good thing. I don't think national insurance rises are fair, because they tend to hit people on the lowest income. It's not a progressive means of taxation. But when we look at the economy in the round, I mean, obviously, we've got such stark inequalities in this country, the worst in Europe, and also the slowest, most sort of grinding recovery of G7 countries in the UK. You don't get out of that by increasing taxes on most people by 1-2%, and then ahead of an election, just like releasing the noose a little bit and then tightening it again. That's not going to work for anyone. If you really want to pull out of an economic slump that we are in, then, stimulating the economy is the way to do that. And if you want to deal with the giant economic disparities in this country, then that does mean taxing wealth. It does mean taxing unearned income. And there's really no way around that. Tinkering around the edges with these kind of cuts isn't really going to make any difference.
OK, Benedict?
I think, as Rachel says, we could have predicted that this was going to come. We're at the sort of the highest tax burden post-war, and it's hitting everybody pretty squarely in the jaw. The thing is, the Tories are sort of damned in both directions, because the other thing that could really stimulate growth in this country would be a program of house building, which would require a significant deregulation in planning laws. Well, the average Conservative voter, many of whom are already saying that they may not vote Conservative, or they may stay at home, would not be particularly happy with that. That's a part of the problem, especially across the South and Southwest, the sort of the blue wall, as it's being called. A lot of people don't want there to be building going on. They don't want to see deregulation. They are the people who will probably feel the extra couple of pence here or there the most. They are probably the ones who will benefit from the campaign that's currently being run in the Telegraph to get rid of inheritance tax. So I think that this is less actually about trying to stimulate mass economic growth. And this is much more about just trying to keep conservative voters who may be feeling apathetic towards the party, just trying to keep them on side, get them out to vote at the next election. I think that things have dropped that far for the Tories, that it's a question of just getting your base back on side and, you know, stumbling towards the election and hoping for the best at this point.
I'm going to stay with you, Benedict, so you can lead off on the next story, which is on the front of the Mail on Sunday. The Mail saying that Labour is going to slash public services in affluent areas if it got into power. Yes,
and this is sort of the other part of the twin-pronged approach when it comes to the Tory election strategy. And it must, I want to also put out, I think it's telling that these stories are starting to come out now, slightly earlier, because of all the sort of the furore around the COVID inquiry and potential embarrassment to the government. But this is the other side, isn't it? It's trying to sort of paint Keir Starmer not actually as a sort of a nice centrist Labour politician, but as a sort of a slightly more left-wing radical. We saw this before. Obviously, we saw it with Jeremy Corbyn. That wasn't difficult to do, but we also saw it with Ed Miliband before. The suggestion that it's going to be taking away money from the middle classes, you know, the sort of the classic swing votes, I suppose. And that's what a lot of this is going to be like, I'm afraid, is that there will be sort of harking back to the days of Jeremy Corbyn. There will be sort of spotlights placed on front bench shadow ministers on his front bench to try to suggest that he is perhaps not quite as centrist and friendly as he has perhaps tried to portray himself. I don't know whether or not that will work. The Mail says that this comes straight from proposals that are being put to Labour members. I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm
going to jump in just because
you can see where this is going.
Yeah, we've had a response from Labour saying these documents are draft internal documents subject to deliberation and amendment and not a final statement of party policy. Let's get a word from you, Rachel, on this.
I mean, I agree with Benedict that this is very much distraction from the COVID inquiry. I also think it just shows that, look, Labour economics aren't that dissimilar to Conservatives now under Starmer's leadership. And it just goes to show that really it doesn't matter how much Labour tries to pander to very right-wing newspapers like this, they're always going to come out gunning for them. I think the key to this story is in the last paragraph on the front page where it says, these proposals to, you know, rob Middle Britain of money and public services and libraries and et cetera, supposedly, it says they're concealed in dry jargon that pledges to enact socioeconomic duty about impact assessments and making sure that there's equity, economic equity across the country. The idea that they're concealed in these equity assessments, I think, tells us all you need to know. If Labour is trying to make sure that deprived neighbourhoods are less deprived in terms of being starved of vital public services, which we know happens across the country. And we've all reported from those places and seen the brutal impact on people of those cuts. If Labour is going to do that and then gets accused of gunning for Middle Britain, you know, I think we can see the sort of flavour of where the right-wing press is going with that and why it's pointless for Labour to ever try and pander. You can't win this game when it's that.
OK, we are out of time. We've got to go to a break. Thank you both very much. Speak again in a moment. Coming up, Manchester City on course to complete the treble after winning the FA Cup. Unsurprisingly, that's in the Manchester Evening News. Don't go away. Hello again, Rachel and Benedict still with us. Benedict, inside the Sunday Express, 31 people arrested. 2 protesters managed to get on the course at the Epsom Derby. Where do you stand on this?
I'm of the opinion that as much as we should enshrine the right to protest, I think actually that this is kind of getting to the point where it's causing a public nuisance and is potentially very dangerous. I think running in front of horses during a race or something like that is potentially putting yourself at risk. It's certainly putting the riders and the horses at risk. And I think that it's also increasingly sort of encouraging people to take matters into their own hands. We see this with people like Extinction Rebellion and protesters in London. And I think the real issue here is police failing in the past to get a grip on this sort of thing and preventing people from behaving like this. And in doing so, you're seeing a bit more of a backlash now, certainly in terms of public opinion. I'd say actually a lot of these protesters are doing their causes a lot of harm, ultimately, in how it is that they go about handling their business. And I think when that happens, I think you've kind of, for such an easy argument to win over things like animal rights, for them to sort of be, turning public opinion against them quite so badly. I think, honestly, they should be aware that their tactics are just having a very detrimental effect to their cause.
Rachel, tactics not working?
Tactics absolutely worked. In all the media all day today, I heard information about the abuse, the animal abuse involved with racehorses, that 15 had died so far this year. Actually, I don't think they're out of kilter with public sentiment. For under 40-year-olds, 80%, according to Animal Rising, oppose Epsom races and others. The point of these protests is to generate publicity and therefore communicate information about the cause. They did exactly that today.
OK, front of the Sunday Telegraph, green levies, Benedict, are going to make the weekly shop even more expensive.
Yes, that's terribly exciting, isn't it? It's a good thing, I suppose, that Rishi Sunak is promising to cut all of our tax if he wins the next election, because this is going to take more money out of our pocket. This could add supposedly about around £140, sorry, £140 a year to your weekly shopping budget, and this is all part of government's plans to make it easier to recycle. It's all part of a scheme that I think Michael Gove set up when he was the Environment Secretary. It's all part of a scheme that also included a bottle return scheme and I think a can recycling scheme. It's one of those sort of every little helps things, but I do think that it's an unnecessary burden for a lot of lower income families right now. £140, it goes a long way ultimately for a lot of people. So, is it the right time? I suppose environmentalists would say that now is the time. But it's another sort of smack in the face, I think, for a lot of people who have had to put up with increasing food costs, increasing energy costs, all sorts of things on the up, and not really seeing any sort of lowering on the horizon, unless Rishi Sunak comes along and knocks 2 pence off every pound in your tax bill.
OK. Rachel, we'll get your thoughts on that one in the next hour. I just want to show this inside the Manchester Evening News. Blues on the brink is the headline. On the brink of the treble, of course. City boss Pep Guardiola there holding up the FA Cup. And big grin on his face, as have the whole team. Great stuff. Thank you both. We shall speak again shortly. Right now, let's finish with a look at the weather.